Somewhere off the coast of southern Iran, in the black water outside Bandar Abbas, something moved across the surface of the Persian Gulf that had never been used in American combat before. No pilot inside it, no crew standing by to bring it home. Just a machine built to go in once, hit its target, and never come back. And when the sun came up over the Strait of Hormuz that morning, a piece of Iran's naval infrastructure that had stood for years was gone, and a new chapter in American warfare had quietly been written. This is the story of the weapon Iran never saw coming, and the week that changed how the United States fights at sea. Let's set the scene because, to understand how big this moment actually is, you need to understand exactly where things stood in the days leading up to it. For most of the past year, the world has been watching a war that many people assumed had already ended. Back in the spring, after weeks of American airstrikes against Iran's nuclear and military infrastructure, the two sides signed a memorandum of understanding. It was supposed to be the off-ramp, 60 days of calm, a chance for Iran to prove it could behave like a responsible actor in one of the most important waterways on Earth, and a chance for the United States to pull back from a war that had already stretched its forces across the region for months. For a while, it looked like it might hold. Then on July 6th, that fragile piece started to come apart. Iran's Revolutionary Guard forces struck 3 commercial vessels in the Strait of Hormuz, including a tanker carrying liquefied natural gas. Iran's government claimed the ships had ignored warnings and were using unauthorized routes. The truth was simpler and uglier. Iran had found a clause in the agreement it signed, a line about ensuring safe passage for commercial vessels, and twisted it into something it was never meant to be. In Tran's new interpretation, safe passage meant Iranian forces got to decide which ships could move and which ones couldn't. If a ship didn't check in with Iran first, it became a target. President Trump's response was immediate and blunt. He told reporters the ceasefire was over. Within days, United States Central Command, the military command responsible for the Middle East, launched what would become a string of retaliatory strikes, each one bigger than the last. The first night hit around 80 targets. The second night, 90. By the fourth wave, the number of targets struck across the week had climbed past 300, spanning missile sites, radar installations, ammunition depots, drone launch facilities, and fast attack boat bases scattered along Iran's southern coastline. And then on the night of July 12th, something different happened, something that had never happened before in the history of American military operations. For the first time ever, the United States used uncrewed surface vessels, sometimes called sea drones or drone boats, as an actual strike weapon in combat. 3 of them, built by a company called Saronic and known by the name Corsair, slipped into the waters near Bandar Abbas naval base under cover of darkness. Their target was a submarine and ship maintenance facility, a place Iran used to service and repair the small fast attack craft it relies on to threaten shipping in the Strait. These boats weren't there to patrol or observe. They weren't there to come home. Each one carried a payload of explosives, and each one was on what the military calls a one-way mission. Once it launched, there was no recall button. It was going to hit something or it was going to fail trying. It didn't fail. Central Command confirmed the strike the following morning in a short but historic statement. Using multiple one-way attack surface drones, the command said its forces had successfully struck the submarine and ship maintenance facility, describing it as the first time American forces had ever employed sea drones in combat operations. 11 words that quietly closed one era of naval warfare and opened another. Now, if you've been following the war closely, you might be wondering why this is such a big deal. After all, the United States has been using aerial drones in this fight for months. Reaper drones, one-way attack drones modeled loosely on Iran's own Shahed design, even a low-cost system called Lucas that mimics the silhouette of the very weapon Iran uses to terrorize Ukrainian and Gulf cities alike. Drones in the air are old news at this point, but drones on the water used specifically to deliver a lethal payload into an enemy target. That's a genuinely new frontier for the United States military. And the story of how it got here says a lot about how modern warfare has changed in just the last few years. To understand where this technology came from, you have to go back to a war that on paper has nothing to do with Iran at all, Ukraine. Since Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022, Ukraine has faced an opponent with one of the largest navies in the world and almost no navy of its own to fight back with. What Ukraine did instead was improvise. Engineers and volunteers built small, fast, unmanned boats packed with explosives, essentially floating bombs that could be steered remotely at high speed toward Russian warships. They were cheap, they were expendable, and they worked far better than almost anyone expected. Ukrainian sea drones have been credited with sinking or severely damaging numerous Russian vessels in the Black Sea, including warships worth many times more than the drones that took them out. It became one of the most lopsided cost exchanges of the entire war. a handful of thousands of dollars in hardware-disabling ships that cost tens or even hundreds of millions to build. The United States Navy noticed. So did defense planners worried about a much bigger, much more distant threat: China's rapidly expanding fleet in the Pacific. If a relatively small resourced country like Ukraine could humble part of a major navy using cheap unmanned boats, what could a country with the industrial and technological resources of the United States build if it took the same idea seriously? That question set off roughly 2 years of accelerated development inside the Pentagon. And it's worth pausing here to introduce someone who represents the kind of person behind that effort. We don't know his real name, and Saren hasn't put a face to this specific program. So think of him as a composite of the engineers actually doing this work around the country. Call him Danny. Danny isn't a fighter pilot. He's never worn a flight suit. He spent his 20s designing holes in control systems in a converted warehouse space, the kind of place with whiteboards covered in half-erased equations and prototype boats sitting on trailers waiting for their next test run. People like Danny are the reason this capability exists at all. While the cameras were pointed at fighter jets thundering off aircraft carriers, engineers like him were quietly building small, fast autonomous vessels designed to do one specific job extremely well: get from point A to point B without a human on board, survive rough seas, and deliver a payload precisely where it's needed. The Pentagon didn't put all its eggs in one basket. Reporting indicates the Navy evaluated designs from at least 6 different manufacturers for this kind of one-way attack sea drone, including Saronic, Martac, Blue Ops, Sierra Nevada, and EU Force, along with additional companies whose involvement hasn't been publicly disclosed. That's a deliberate strategy. When you're building a brand new category of weapon, you don't want to bet everything on a single design that might have a fatal flaw nobody's discovered yet. You want competition, redundancy, and options. Saronic's Corsair emerged as the vessel that made history, but it wasn't the first time this specific platform had been in the headlines this year. In fact, if you were paying close attention back in June, you might remember a very different kind of story involving the exact same type of drone. An American AH-64 Apache helicopter went down in the Gulf of Oman after being struck by Iranian fire. 2 crew members were in the water in hostile territory in the middle of an active war zone. And the vessel that helped rescue them wasn't a traditional Navy ship or a helicopter. It was a Saronic Corsair unmanned surface vessel operated by a Navy unit called Task Force 59, which had been fielding these drones in the region since late March. A machine with no crew aboard helped bring American aviators home alive. At the time, it was framed as a remarkable but relatively quiet milestone, the first known instance of an uncrewed surface vessel assisting directly in a personnel recovery mission. Now consider the emotional weight of that detail for a moment. The same class of boat that once helped save American lives in that stretch of water became weeks later the weapon that struck deep into Iranian naval infrastructure. It's the kind of full-circle moment that almost feels too neat for reality, except it happened. And it says something important about how flexible this new generation of unmanned systems really is. The same basic hole and autonomy stack that can locate and assist stranded aviators can also be loaded with explosives and sent on a strike mission. One platform, radically different missions depending on what the moment demands. Let's talk about what actually happened during the strike itself, because the details that have come out paint a picture of just how precise and deliberate this operation was. The target wasn't a random patch of coastline. It was a submarine and ship maintenance facility at Bandar Abbas Naval Base, one of Iran's most significant naval installations sitting right along the Strait of Hormuz. This is the kind of facility that keeps a fleet running. It's where damaged vessels get patched up, where fast attack boats get serviced between operations, where the physical backbone of Iran's ability to harass shipping in the Strait gets maintained. Hitting a target like this isn't about a single dramatic explosion. It's about degrading Iran's capacity to sustain its naval harassment campaign over the long term. You can replace a boat. It's much harder and much slower to replace the infrastructure that keeps an entire fleet operational. Picture for a moment someone who might have been watching that maintenance facility go dark from a rooftop a few blocks away. We don't know his name. Nobody has confirmed a specific eyewitness account of this exact strike. So think of him as a composite stand-in for the kind of person who actually experiences these nights firsthand. Someone we might call Reza, a dock worker who spent years around that facility, who knows every crane and gate by sound alone. For someone like him, the strange part wouldn't have been the explosion itself. Iran's coastline has absorbed hundreds of strikes over the preceding week. The strange part would have been what came before it. No jet engines roaring overhead. No missile contrails streaking across the sky. Just a quiet approach across the water, low and fast, and then impact. If there really was Aziza standing on that dock that night, the loudest sound he might have heard before the explosion may have been nothing at all. That silence is precisely the point of this new weapon. Traditional airstrikes give you a signature. Radar can sometimes pick up an inbound jet. Heat sensors can detect missile launches. Air defense crews train for years to identify these signals and react. A small, low, fast-moving boat skimming across dark water presents a completely different problem. It's harder to detect on radar because of its size and profile. It doesn't leave the kind of thermal signature a jet engine does, and by the time anyone on the ground identifies it as a threat, if they identify it at all, it may already be too late to stop. This is exactly the vulnerability that made Ukraine's sea drone campaign against Russia's Black Sea Fleet so devastating. And it's exactly the vulnerability the United States appears to be exploiting now against Iran's naval forces in the Gulf. Centcom has been notably tight-lipped about certain details of this program, and it's important to be upfront about what is confirmed and what remains unclear. The command has not disclosed the exact number of sea drones deployed beyond the 3 Corsair vessels, specifically named in connection with the Bandar Abbas strike. Nor has it released full technical specifications for the platform's range, speed, or payload capacity in this operational context. Some outside reporting has suggested a design in this general category can travel well over 40 miles per hour and carry a substantial explosive payload. But those figures should be treated as informed estimation rather than officially confirmed fact, since the military has kept much of the granular detail classified, even while publicizing the broader strategic milestone. This is a deliberate pattern that is held throughout the wider campaign. American officials have been willing to announce strike totals and general target categories, but they have consistently withheld specifics that might help Iran develop countermeasures. What we do know from Centcom's own statements is the shape of the broader strike package that night. It wasn't just sea drones acting alone. The operation combined fighter aircraft, naval vessels, one-way attack, aerial drones, and for the first time, one-way attack sea drones, all working together as part of a single coordinated effort. Think of it less like one weapon doing all the work and more like an orchestra, each instrument playing a specific role. Fighter jets and suppression aircraft work to clear or confuse enemy air defenses and strike targets that require speed and range. Aerial drones handle other categories of targets, often ones where risking a manned aircraft doesn't make sense. And now sea drones handle the category that used to require either a risky close-in naval bombardment or a special forces operation. Targets sitting right at the W's edge, protected as much by geography as by any defense system. This is where a third figure becomes useful to understand the strategic thinking behind decisions like this. Picture a mid-level planner inside 5th Fleet headquarters in Bahrain, someone we can call Commander Ellis, a composite stand-in for the officers who actually build these strike packages. Her job in this hypothetical but realistic scenario is to look at a map covered in potential targets and figure out which platform should hit which one based on risk, based on what's likely to survive Iranian air defenses, and based on what each strike is actually trying to accomplish strategically. For a target like a hardened radar site deep inland, you probably want a precision-guided bomb from a manned aircraft with enough altitude and speed to avoid being an easy target. For a coastal maintenance facility sitting right on the water, a slow, low, hard-to-detect surface vessel might actually be the safer, smarter choice, because it never has to enter contested airspace at all. It approaches entirely within its own domain, the water, where Iran's air defense network offers it almost no protection whatsoever. That's the quiet genius of this new capability. It doesn't just add another weapon to the arsenal, it closes a gap. Every square mile of Iranian coastline that used to require either a risky airstrike or an even riskier boots on the water special operation can now potentially be reached by an autonomous vessel that cost a fraction of a manned mission and put 0 American lives directly at risk during the strike itself. Let's talk about the reaction, because the moment Centcom's statement went public, it rippled out in several very different directions at once. Financial markets responded almost instantly. Brent crude, the global benchmark for oil prices, jumped nearly 4% in a single day, climbing to just under $79 a barrel. That might sound like an abstract number, but it reflects something very real. The Strait of Hormuz typically carries around 1/5 of the world's oil traffic. Every time tensions escalate there, traders around the world recalculate the risk that a critical percentage of global energy supply could get disrupted, and prices move accordingly. The debut of a new American strike capability specifically aimed at degrading Iran's ability to threaten that waterway is exactly the kind of headline that sends those calculations into motion. Politically, President Trump wasted no time framing the moment in characteristically direct terms. Speaking to reporters, he insisted the Strait of Hormuz was open and would remain open with or without Iran's cooperation. He went further, describing an intention for the United States to essentially guarantee safe passage through the strait going forward, floating the idea that America would become what he called the guardian of that waterway. Whether or not you agree with the framing, the underlying message was clear. The strikes weren't just about punishing Iran for the tanker attacks. They were about establishing a new baseline of American control over one of the most strategically important choke points on the planet. Iran's response, meanwhile, has followed the same pattern it's followed throughout the past several years. Officials publicly refused to acknowledge losing ground, even as the physical evidence piled up. State-affiliated media in Iran reported that an American-made Lucas drone had been shot down near Bandar Abbas, a claim seemingly intended to reassure the domestic audience that Iranian defenses were still functioning even as 3 sea drones successfully struck a major naval facility just miles away. Iran's Ministry of Foreign Affairs issued a statement condemning the American strikes as a serious threat to regional peace, while Iranian forces simultaneously launched their own retaliatory attacks against American-linked military installations in Bahrain, Kuwait, Jordan, and Qatar. Some of those Iranian projectiles were intercepted. Some caused damage. In at least one case, in Iran's own Khuzestan province, a strike reportedly hit an agricultural water pumping station, killing 1 person and injuring 4, according to local officials. A grim reminder that even in a conflict dominated by headlines about drones and precision weapons, real human costs continue to accumulate on the ground. It's worth being honest here about the limits of what's confirmed. Some claims from Iranian state media, including specific casualty figures or details about intercepted American drones, have not been independently verified by outside observers. And in a conflict this fast-moving, both sides have strong incentives to shape the narrative in their favor. What can be stated with confidence based on Centcom's own public statements and corroborating reporting from multiple independent outlets is that the sea drone strike on the Bandar Abbas maintenance facility did happen, that it marked the first combat use of uncrewed surface vessels in American military history, and that it took place as part of a broader, well-documented campaign that has struck more than 300 targets across Iran over the course of roughly 1 week. So what does this actually mean going forward? Why should anyone outside the world of military analysts care about 3 small unmanned boats hitting one facility on one night? Because this is one of those moments that looks small in isolation, but represents an enormous shift when you zoom out. For decades, naval power has largely meant big, expensive, heavily crewed vessels, destroyers, cruisers, aircraft carriers, submarines, ships that take years to build, cost billions of dollars, and put thousands of sailors in harm's way every time they deploy into contested waters. The rise of cheap, autonomous one-way attack vessels doesn't replace that traditional navy, at least not anytime soon, but it fundamentally changes the math of naval warfare. A single Iranian fast attack boat, one of the kind Iran has used repeatedly to harass shipping in the Strait, can reportedly cost anywhere from several $100,000 to well over $1 million depending on its configuration. A one-way attack sea drone built specifically to destroy something like that cost a small fraction of that price, and it never has to survive the mission to be considered a success. This is the same brutal logic that has reshaped modern conflicts from Ukraine to the Red Sea to now the Persian Gulf. Expensive, exquisite platforms are increasingly vulnerable to cheap, numerous, expendable ones. The country that figures out how to build and deploy that cheap, numerous capability at scale gains a serious advantage, especially in contested choke points like the Strait of Hormuz, where geography forces everyone into tight, predictable spaces. And there's a broader strategic story here too, one that connects directly back to why the Pentagon accelerated this program in the first place. This capability wasn't built with Iran specifically in mind. It was built with an eye toward the Pacific, toward the possibility of a future confrontation involving Chinese naval forces operating across a much larger and more contested body of water. Iran, in that sense, has become something like a live-fire, proving ground for a weapons system designed with a much bigger, much more consequential rival in mind. Every lesson learned in the Strait of Hormuz, what works, what doesn't, how these vessels perform in real combat conditions against a real adaptive enemy, gets fed back into a program that will likely shape how the United States Navy operates for the next generation. That's a sobering thought if you sit with it for a moment. The vessels striking Bandar Abbas this week are, in a very real sense, a preview, a test run for a capability that may end up mattering just as much, if not more, in a completely different part of the world someday. Back in the Gulf, the immediate picture remains messy and unresolved. Shipping through the Strait of Hormuz has slowed to its lowest level in roughly 5 weeks, according to data from trade intelligence firms tracking vessel movements. Some ships are still making the transit. 6 were reported crossing on a single recent day, carrying millions of barrels of oil and petroleum products between Iranian and Kuwaiti ports. But the overall flow has clearly been disrupted, and both sides continue to offer conflicting claims about who actually controls the waterway. Iran insists it retains the right to manage traffic through what it considers its territorial waters. The United States insists the Strait remains international water open to all, regardless of what Iran claims. Neither side has shown any sign of backing down from that basic disagreement, and that disagreement, more than any single weapon system, is what's actually driving this entire conflict forward. There's also been discussion around Oman potentially playing a mediating role, exploring the idea of some kind of joint maritime security arrangement, or even transit fees for vessels passing through the Strait. Analysts have pointed out that international law generally doesn't allow individual countries to charge tolls for passage through a strait governed by the principle of transit passage, meaning any fee-based arrangement would likely have to get creative to avoid violating established maritime law. Whether that idea goes anywhere remains to be seen. And it's the kind of detail worth watching closely in the weeks ahead, because a negotiated framework for managing the Strait, even an imperfect one, could matter just as much for global oil markets as another night of strikes. For now, though, the headline remains the Sea Drones. 3 vessels, no crew, 1 mission each, and a maintenance facility at one of Iran's most important naval bases reduced to rubble. It's the kind of moment that will likely get studied in military memes for years. Not because of the scale of destruction, which by the standards of this conflict was relatively contained, but because of what it represents. The moment American forces stopped only using unmanned systems to watch, to scout, to occasionally strike from the air, and started using them to fight directly on the water, the same domain where Iran has spent years building its asymmetric strategy of small boats and swarm tactics. There's a kind of poetic justice buried in that shift. If you think about it, for years, Iran's entire naval doctrine in the Gulf has been built around using cheap, numerous, fast, small boats to threaten much larger and more expensive American and Allied vessels. It was Iran's version of an equalizer, a way to make the world's most powerful navy think twice before operating too freely in the Strait. Now, the United States has effectively adopted a version of that same playbook and turned it back on Iran's own infrastructure. The hunter has become something being hunted by its own hunting strategy, just executed with more resources, more technology, and so far considerably more success. Nobody knows exactly how the next few weeks will unfold. Iran's leadership has shown no consistent pattern of backing down after individual setbacks, even significant ones. And there are still real unresolved questions about who exactly holds ultimate authority over military decisions inside Iran right now, given the deep uncertainty surrounding the health and whereabouts of the country's top leadership throughout this conflict. What has seemed clear is that the introduction of sea drones into this fight isn't a one-time novelty. Task Force 59 has been building toward this capability since at least March. The Pentagon evaluated multiple manufacturers specifically to make sure this technology could scale, and Centcom's own language describing this as a new addition to an already expanding strike package strongly suggests this was the beginning of a sustained capability, not a single demonstration meant to clear his throat to send a message and then quietly disappear. If that's true, then the maintenance facility at Bandar Abbas may end up being remembered as the first target in a much longer list. Every submarine pen, every small boat harbor, every coastal repair yard along Iran's southern coastline just became reachable in a way it wasn't a week ago by a weapon that's quiet, fast, hard to detect, and doesn't ask anyone to risk their life to deliver it. It also helps to understand just how fast this entire category of weapon has moved from theory to battlefield reality, because the timeline is genuinely remarkable. Unmanned surface vessels aren't a brand new idea. Navies around the world have experimented with Rematech-controlled boats for decades, mostly for tasks like minesweeping, harbor security, or towing targets during training exercises. What's changed in just the past few years isn't the basic concept of an uncrewed boat. It's the combination of 3 things arriving at the same time. Cheap, reliable autonomy software that lets a small vessel navigate open water without constant human control. Inexpensive commercial components that make these boats affordable to build in meaningful numbers, and a proven combat template courtesy of Ukraine, showing exactly how devastating this approach can be against a much larger conventional navy. Before Ukraine's campaign in the Black Sea, most naval planners around the world still thought of unmanned surface vessels, primarily as support tools, useful for scouting and logistics, but not something you'd trust to carry out an actual strike mission. Ukraine changed that assumption almost overnight. Within about 2 years, a country with essentially no traditional navy managed to force Russia's Black Sea fleet to pull much of its most valuable hardware away from Crimea entirely, retreating to ports further from the front lines simply because staying within range of Ukrainian sea drones had become too dangerous. That's an extraordinary outcome, achieved largely with boats that individually cost a tiny fraction of what a single Russian frigate cost to build. American defense planners studied that outcome closely. And it's worth remembering that the shift towards sea drones didn't happen in a vacuum inside the Pentagon. It happened alongside a broader rethinking of naval strategy, driven largely by concerns about China. Chinese shipyards have been producing naval vessels at a pace that has alarmed analysts across the political spectrum for years now, and the numerical gap between the size of the Chinese Navy and the size of the American Navy has been closing steadily. Building enough traditional warships to match that pace would take enormous amounts of time and money, resources that aren't easy to conjure quickly, even for a country with the industrial base of the United States. Cheap, fast to produce, autonomous vessels offer a potential shortcut, a way to add meaningful offensive and defensive capability to the fleet without waiting years for a new destroyer to roll off the line. That's part of why the Pentagon moved to evaluate so many different manufacturers at once, rather than settling on a single design early. Speed mattered as much as perfection. A military that can field a decent unmanned vessel today, while continuing to refine better versions over the following months, gains a real advantage over one that spends 5 years chasing a theoretically ideal design before deploying anything at all. The Corsair's debut in Iran then isn't really the end of a development story. It's closer to a checkpoint, a moment where a program that had been maturing quietly for roughly 2 years finally proved itself in the one environment that matters most: live combat against a real adaptive enemy. It's also worth pausing on just how unusual it is for the Pentagon to confirm a new weapons capability this openly while it's still actively being used. Historically, brand new American military technology tends to stay classified for years before officials acknowledge it publicly, often only after journalists or outside analysts piece together evidence from satellite imagery or leaked documents. Centcom's decision to announce the sea drone strike within roughly a day, complete with details about the target and the number of vessels involved, suggests this wasn't just a battlefield tactic. It was also a message aimed as much at Thrawn and at rival powers watching from Beijing and Moscow as at the American public. The message is straightforward enough to understand without any special expertise. The United States now has a functioning combat-tested capability to strike coastal and maritime targets using cheap autonomous vessels, and it's willing to use that capability whenever the situation calls for it. For a regime like Iran's, which has spent years relying on the assumption that its coastline and territorial waters offered a degree of natural protection against anything short of a full airstrike, that message lands especially hard. The calculation used to be relatively simple from Thrawn's perspective. Small boats and coastal facilities sitting close to shore were harder and riskier for American forces to hit directly compared to targets further inland that could be reached by aircraft or missiles from a safe distance. That calculation no longer holds. If a swarm of low-cost, hard-to-detect vessels can approach quietly from the water itself and strike a target sitting right at the waterline, then very little along Iran's coastline remains genuinely safe, regardless of how it's defended against traditional air threats. None of this guarantees how the broader conflict resolves. Wars, especially ones tangled up with negotiations, ceasefires, and deep uncertainty about who's actually making decisions on the other side, rarely follow a clean, predictable script. But it does help explain why this particular moment, 3 small unmanned boats hitting one maintenance facility, has generated so much attention from analysts who spend their careers thinking about the future of naval warfare. It's not really about what happened at Bandar Abbas specifically. It's about what that strike confirms is now possible, and about how quickly that possibility is likely to keep expanding in the months ahead, both in the Persian Gulf and in every other contested body of water where American forces might eventually need to operate. Snorts. That's the story of the weapon Iran never saw coming. Not a single dramatic superweapon unveiled with fanfare, but a quiet, patient buildup of unmanned technology, tested in one war, refined in a defense lab, deployed for the first time in a rescue mission that saved American lives, and then turned weeks later into a strike weapon that opened an entirely new front in a conflict that shows no signs of slowing down. Whatever happens next in the Strait of Hormuz, one thing has already changed for good. The water itself is no longer neutral ground. And for the first time in American military history, that shift didn't come from a jet, a missile, or a submarine. It came from 3 small boats with nobody on board, moving quietly across the dark, doing exactly what they were built to do.